The court humiliated the black girl and wouldn't even let her call her mother. But an hour later, Ronda Rousey walked in and everything was upside down. Subscribe and comment where you're watching us from. The morning sun had barely pushed through the thick marine layer hanging over Santa Barbara when La'Akea Makalayan Rousey sat in the back seat of the town car, her face pressed gently to the cool glass. School was less than 20 minutes away, but the silence in the car made it feel longer. Her driver, a woman in her 40s named Brenda, hummed to an old R&B tune playing faintly from the radio. La'Akea didn't speak. She rarely did during these rides. This was her quiet time, the final moment of control before stepping into a place that felt more like a performance stage than a school. Brenda glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You okay, kiddo?" La'Akea nodded without lifting her head. "Yeah, just thinking." Brenda didn't press further. She'd been driving La'Akea to and from the private academy for nearly a year now and had learned to read her moods. This morning, the girl was especially quiet. There was something about the air, heavy, expectant, as though something was waiting to happen. La'Akea was 13, but carried herself like someone older. She was slender, soft-spoken, and rarely made eye contact unless she had to. Her long, dark hair was tied into a simple braid that fell over one shoulder. She wore her uniform, white button-down blouse, navy skirt, black shoes, with neat precision, though never with pride. Uniforms, she thought, were for people trying to belong. She didn't. At school, she was always that girl, the one with the famous mother, the daughter of the fighter. Teachers smiled politely when they saw her, but their tone carried a subtle condescension. Some classmates whispered behind her back, while others ignored her entirely. To them, she was an enigma not worth understanding. Her last name drew attention, and attention brought discomfort. She'd learned long ago that being quiet, staying low, was safer. By the time Brenda pulled up to the school gate, the sun had started to warm the campus walls. Students swarmed the entrance, laughing, talking, comparing homework. La'Akea stepped out with her backpack slung over one shoulder and made her way toward the side entrance. She didn't walk slowly or quickly, just carefully, deliberately, as if her very pace might draw the wrong kind of attention. The first few classes passed uneventfully. She sat in the back, scribbled notes, answered questions only when called upon. During break, she ate lunch alone under a jacaranda tree by the library, the same spot she had chosen on her first day. No one ever asked to sit with her, and she never invited anyone. It was just past noon when it began. She was in the hallway near her locker, quietly switching out textbooks, when the dean of student conduct, Mr. Reiner, appeared at the end of the corridor. He was flanked by the school security officer and the assistant principal. Their eyes found her instantly. "La'Akea Rousey," Reiner called, his voice loud and flat. "Come with us, please." Every student in the hall turned, heads swiveled, phones came out. La'Akea froze, her hand still gripping the edge of her locker door. Her heart thudded once, hard. She stepped forward slowly, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Is something wrong?" "You'll find out soon enough," the officer said curtly. "Please come along." They didn't put her in cuffs, not yet, but the way they surrounded her made it clear she wasn't just being called for a chat. Whispers trailed behind her as they walked down the hall. One student, a blonde girl she recognized from gym class, snickered and whispered to another, "Bet her mom's gonna choke somebody out over this." They took her to the main office into a windowless conference room that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner. Waiting inside were two uniformed officers from the local precinct and the school principal, Miss Ehrlich, who folded her hands on the table as Lakia entered. "Sit," one of the officers instructed. She did. Miss Ehrlich looked tired. Her voice was firm, rehearsed. "Lakia, earlier this morning a teacher discovered a suspicious package in a backpack during random locker inspections." Lakia's throat tightened. "Okay. The backpack in question was yours." "No, it wasn't." Her voice was calm, but her stomach twisted. "That's not possible. It had your name on it. Your ID was inside." She blinked, confused. "It wasn't mine when I left for school this morning." The officer leaned in. "Are you saying someone planted it?" "I'm saying I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't have anything in my bag that didn't belong to me." The principal cleared her throat. "Unfortunately, due to the nature of the contents, controlled substances, we are required by law to report the incident. The police will handle the next steps." Lakea's heart plummeted. "You think I'm selling drugs?" "We're not making assumptions," the officer said, "but based on what we found, you'll need to come with us." Still, they didn't cuff her, not yet. They led her out through the back hallway toward the campus exit. Students in the quad noticed. Someone shouted her name. Someone else laughed. This wasn't happening. She sat silently in the back of the squad car, her hands trembling in her lap. The officer in the passenger seat glanced back at her briefly, then looked away. At the station, they processed her with mechanical efficiency. She removed her shoelaces. They asked if she had a legal guardian to contact. When she mentioned her mother, the tone shifted. "You mean Ronda Rousey?" one officer said, raising an eyebrow. "The fighter?" "She's not just a fighter," Lakia muttered. The other officer chuckled. "I guess it runs in the family, huh?" She didn't respond. They placed her in a holding cell designed for juveniles. Pale walls, metal bench, fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. There were no windows. Just a small square of reinforced glass on the door that looked out into the hallway. An hour passed, then another. They brought her a paper cup of water and a prepackaged sandwich, which she didn't touch. When she asked if she could call her mother, the officer outside her door shook his head. "That'll be handled through the courts. You'll get your chance." "What about my lawyer?" "One will be assigned to you." She didn't ask anything else. She understood. This was happening with or without her understanding. Night fell. She curled up on the bench, her backpack taken from her, her ID locked in an evidence bag. Somewhere in the haze between sleep and waking, she saw her mother's face. Not the version people saw on magazine covers or UFC highlight reels, but the one she remembered from quiet mornings at home. The look that said, "I'm here. You're safe." Lakia didn't feel safe. The next morning, they woke her at 6 and gave her a uniform. Orange, baggy, the fabric stiff with starch. They transported her in a van with tinted windows, 2 officers seated on either side. No one spoke. When they arrived at the courthouse, the early light had just begun to stretch across the pavement. The building loomed large and gray, like a monument to cold authority. She walked with her head down, led through a side entrance, past security and metal detectors. Her appointed lawyer met her in a waiting room, tall, distracted, reeking of stale coffee. "I've read over your file," he said quickly. "It's a formality today, just a hearing for detainment. Try not to say too much." She wanted to ask him something, anything, but his eyes were already on his phone. Minutes later, they entered the courtroom. The judge was already seated, a man in his 60s with a wide jaw and thin mouth. His robe hung neatly over his shoulders, his eyes unreadable. "Name," he said without looking up. "Lakia Rousey," she answered. Murmurs rippled through the room. The judge finally glanced up, his expression flickering. "Interesting name," he said. "We're all familiar with your mother's reputation." Her lawyer made no motion to respond. The charges were read: possession of controlled substances, intent to distribute on school grounds. Each word hit her like a stone. Then came the moment she would remember for the rest of her life. "Your Honor," she said softly, "may I call my mother?" The judge smirked. "This isn't a phone booth, young lady. Please, she doesn't know." "She'll read about it like the rest of us," the judge interrupted. "Proceed." Even the clerk laughed. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The gavel struck once, a hollow sound that sealed the decision. Lakia Rousey was remanded to juvenile detention pending further investigation. No phone call, no voice to reach out, just the silence of the courtroom as she was led away. But in the echo of that silence, in the back of her mind, a whisper began to rise. Not yet. She still had one move left. The air inside the juvenile detention van was thick with a sour blend of sweat and disinfectant. Lakia sat on a hard plastic bench, her wrists bound in front of her with plastic cuffs, her ankles shackled to a metal ring on the floor. The vehicle lurched forward without warning, jolting her against the sidewall. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried yet, not when they found the drugs in her bag, not when the judge denied her phone call, not even when the laughter in the courtroom chased her down the corridor like a pack of hyenas. But something inside her had cracked. She could feel it. A quiet, almost imperceptible split, like a hairline fracture in glass, nearly invisible but irreversible. It was still early when they reached the courthouse. The sun had risen just enough to cast long, pale stripes across the stone steps. A uniformed officer opened the back door and motioned for her to step out. She did so carefully, her ankles clinking with every movement. The cuffs bit into her skin, but she didn't flinch. She knew better than to complain. She'd already learned that the people around her didn't listen, not to her words, not to her fear, not to the truth. Inside the courthouse, she was led through a side corridor to the juvenile hearing room. It was smaller than the courtroom from the day before, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead. A few people sat scattered among the pew-like benches: court staff, a security officer, and a couple of strangers she didn't recognize. Her public defender, the same one from yesterday, was already seated at the defense table, looking as disheveled and rushed as he had the day before. He barely glanced at her as she was led to her seat. The judge entered minutes later. A different one this time. Younger, sharper features, a thinning patch of gray hair combed over carefully. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file before him. "Lakia Rousey," he said aloud, tapping the folder. "Possession of narcotics with intent to distribute. Secondary charge, possession on school property. Let the record show the minor is present with counsel." Her name rang out like a gunshot in the small room. She winced. The prosecutor, a tall man in a fitted suit and smug demeanor, stood and addressed the court. His voice was smooth, practiced. He recited the charges, emphasized the danger of narcotics in schools, mentioned the importance of setting an example. He referenced her mother twice, indirectly. "This is not a case where the minor comes from a disadvantaged home," he said. "Her family has resources, status. This kind of behavior, therefore, cannot be chalked up to desperation. It suggests recklessness, arrogance." Laakea's fist clenched in her lap. Her lawyer didn't object. He merely nodded along as if waiting for the storm to pass. The judge turned to her. "Do you understand the charges against you?" She nodded. "Do you wish to make a statement at this time?" She swallowed. Her throat was dry. "I didn't do it," she said quietly. "Someone put that in my bag. I didn't—" The judge held up a hand, already dismissing her words. "You'll have the opportunity to present your defense at the trial, Miss Rousey. This hearing is simply to determine pre-trial detainment." "But I didn't even get to call my mom." Another interruption. "You are under the custody of the state. Your legal representative is here. That's all that is required." She turned slightly, looking at her lawyer, silently begging for help. He cleared his throat and finally spoke. "Your Honor, we request that the minor be released to her guardian until the trial date. She has no prior record, no history of behavioral issues, and poses no flight risk." The prosecutor scoffed. "That guardian would be Miss Ronda Rousey, correct?" The judge's mouth curled slightly. "I believe we are all familiar with her professional reputation." There was laughter. Not loud, not overt, but unmistakably real. A court clerk covered her mouth. A bailiff smirked. Even the stenographer rolled her eyes. "She's not on a movie set now," the prosecutor added. "Let's not pretend a cage fighter is an appropriate supervisory figure for a minor facing felony charges." Laakea's face burned. She stared down at her shoes, trying to hold herself together. The shame was a physical thing, suffocating, clawing its way up her throat. The judge banged the gavel lightly. "Request for release is denied. The minor will remain in juvenile custody pending trial. Next hearing date is scheduled for 7 days from today." Just like that, it was over. No questions, no review of the footage, no discussion of inconsistencies, just laughter, mockery, and a decision that echoed like a door slamming shut. As the bailiff approached to take her away, Laakea made one last attempt. She turned toward the bench, her voice louder this time. "Please, just let me call my mom." The judge didn't even look up. "Request denied. You had your opportunity yesterday. Let's proceed." The courtroom door opened. The bailiff gestured. She stood, her limbs heavy, as if every step pulled her deeper into something she couldn't escape. She didn't remember the walk back to the holding room. She didn't remember being reshackled or the drive back to the juvenile facility. Her mind had gone somewhere else, someplace numb, detached. It wasn't until she was sitting alone again in her cell, staring at the blank wall, that the pressure inside her chest finally gave way. Not tears, not a scream, just a quiet exhale that trembled with exhaustion. An hour passed, then 2. During evening check-in, a different guard came by. She was older, wore a faded uniform, and had tired eyes. When she looked through the small glass window in Laakea's door, something in her expression shifted. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. "You haven't made any phone calls," the woman said softly. "They wouldn't let me," Laakea replied, her voice barely audible. The woman hesitated. Then, without a word, she pulled a key from her belt and unlocked the door to the phone alcove down the hall. "You have 1 minute," she said. "Use it wisely." Laakea stared for a beat, uncertain if it was real. Then she stood, walked quickly, her legs trembling with each step. The phone was mounted to the wall, the buttons worn smooth from overuse. She took the receiver in hand and dialed the only number she knew by heart. It rang twice. Then a voice answered, her mother's voice. "Hello?" Laakea closed her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, "they're trying to break me." There was silence. No questions, no confusion, just breath. "I'll be there," her mother said. "Hold on." The line went dead. Laakea stood still, the phone pressed to her ear, long after the call ended. She didn't know how, but something had changed. It was in the air, in her chest, in the quiet that followed. The storm had spoken. Now something else was coming. She didn't know what it would look like. She only knew it would have her mother's voice, and it would not be ignored. The next morning began with the same bleak monotony. Steel trays clattering in the mess hall, the screech of rubber soles on polished concrete, and the bark of correctional officers echoing through the halls of the juvenile center. Laakea moved through it all like a shadow. She kept her head down, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes lowered. Something inside her had hardened. The humiliation of the previous day still clung to her skin like frost. The judge's smirk, the laughter in the courtroom, the way they all dismissed her like she was a stray dog yapping for scraps. Those moments replayed in her mind like a cruel joke. The worst part wasn't the accusations or the cell or even the isolation. It was that no one had listened. But she had made the call. She had said the words, and her mother had heard them. Laakea didn't know what her mother could do, didn't know if anything could truly reverse what had been set in motion. But she knew one thing. When Ronda Rousey said, "I'll be there," she meant it. And that meant something, maybe everything. At that very moment, miles away, Ronda was already moving. She hadn't slept. As soon as she hung up the phone the night before, she'd thrown a few clothes into a duffel, grabbed her passport, then tossed it back in the drawer. This wasn't a border crossing. This was war. A quiet, legal, reputational war, the kind where the enemy wore suits and used condescension like a weapon. But she had fought tougher. Ronda's mind was fire, every frame of Laakea's childhood flashing before her in sharp, painful detail. The first time she said, "Mama." The time she broke her arm climbing a tree and tried not to cry. The way she used to sleep curled against her chest, a tiny heartbeat steady against her own. And now she was alone in a cold institution, accused of something impossible, her voice silenced by a room full of people who didn't even pretend to care. She didn't scream, didn't post anything online. She didn't even call her PR agent. Ronda's fury was not a firestorm, it was precision. She called one person, Tasha Menendez, an old friend and a lawyer with a reputation that made federal prosecutors flinch. Within 20 minutes, Tasha was in her kitchen in a hoodie and sneakers, no makeup, 3 coffees deep, and already pulling files. "I've got a contact in juvenile affairs, and I'm calling a judge I clerked for," she said. "Give me the case number, the name of the public defender, and the DA. "Just tell me where to stand and who to look at," Ronda answered, deadly calm. They mocked her in court. They what? They laughed when she asked to call me. The judge said this isn't a movie set. Tasha blinked. Oh, hell no. By dawn, Ronda was in a black SUV heading up the coast. No entourage, no cameras, no script. She didn't want attention. She wanted results. She wanted her daughter. She wore black jeans, a dark leather jacket, and a plain gray hoodie. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid, her jaw set. The driver, a trusted family friend, didn't speak unless spoken to. The tension in the car was palpable. As they neared the courthouse, the sun was cresting behind them, casting long rays over the Pacific. In another world, it might have been a beautiful morning, but not here. Not now. In the juvenile courtroom, Laakea was once again seated at the defense table, shackled lightly at the ankles, her uniform stiff and too large. Her lawyer sat beside her, flipping through paperwork he clearly hadn't read. The bailiff looked bored. The judge reviewed his docket. Then the doors opened. The silence that followed was unnatural. Every head turned. Every body shifted. Ronda stepped into the room. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She walked with calm certainty down the center aisle, her boots heavy against the tile, her eyes locked on her daughter. The prosecutor's mouth parted slightly in recognition, then quickly closed. The clerk stopped typing. Even the judge froze for a half-second before recovering. Ronda took a seat in the first row of the gallery, directly behind her daughter. She placed her hands on her knees and waited. The judge cleared his throat. This court is now in session." Lakia didn't turn around, but her spine straightened. She felt a shift like a sudden gust of wind behind her. Her mother was here. That was enough. The prosecutor began speaking, stammering slightly as he laid out the charges once again. His tone was less confident than the day before. There was a hesitation now. The air had changed. When the judge addressed Lakia, asking if she understood the charges, Ronda rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady, "I am Lakia Rousey's mother. I have legal custody and was denied the right to be notified of her detainment. I'm here now. I'm requesting immediate reconsideration of her remand and the right to speak on her behalf." The courtroom held its breath. The judge stared at her. "Miss Rousey, this isn't a media circus. You can't—" "I'm not here as a celebrity," Ronda interrupted. "I'm here as a mother whose daughter was arrested without cause, denied a phone call, mocked by court staff, and incarcerated on a charge with no verified evidence." The judge opened his mouth. Ronda stepped forward. "I have a legal team already reviewing every piece of this case. I have a civil rights attorney waiting outside, and I have every right to speak." The silence returned. Then, with visible reluctance, the judge nodded. "You may proceed." Ronda looked directly at her daughter. "Lakia, you're not alone." Then she turned back to the judge. "I want this on record. We will be filing motions for evidence disclosure, discovery of all communication between school administrators and law enforcement, and a full review of the search procedure conducted on my daughter's property. We are also requesting video surveillance from the school dated 48 hours before the incident." The judge looked uncomfortable. The prosecutor stared at the floor. Lakia stared at her mother with wide, wet eyes. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Ronda sat down. The judge glanced at the bailiff. "Proceed with scheduling a continuation hearing. Defense motions will be reviewed." The gavel came down with a dull thud. No one clapped, but everyone felt the shift. Lakia was led back to her holding area, but this time there was no slouch in her walk. She held her chin slightly higher. Back in the hallway, the prosecutor pulled the judge aside. "We need to be careful. She's not just anyone. She's a mother," the judge said, "and right now, she's angry." That evening, Ronda visited her daughter in the holding facility. They were separated by a thick pane of glass and a phone receiver. But it didn't matter. They spoke with their eyes. "I'm going to fix this," Ronda said. "They won't touch you again. Not like this." Lakia nodded slowly. "I didn't think anyone was coming." "I'll always come," Ronda whispered. That night, the center staff noticed something strange. Supervisors met in private. Emails were flagged. One staffer made a quiet call to his union rep. Another deleted messages from his phone. Because word had spread. Ronda Rousey was in town, and she was just getting started. The world did not erupt when Ronda Rousey entered the courtroom. There were no news vans, no camera flashes, no microphones jammed into her face, at least not yet. But inside the sealed, climate-controlled world of the juvenile justice system, her arrival was a detonation. The tremors didn't register on seismographs, but they rippled through people. The bailiff who stood up a little straighter, the prosecutor who double-checked his notes 3 times, the clerk who suddenly remembered every detail of the law with military precision. Something had changed. Something was shifting. Back in her room at the detention center, La'Akea sat on the thin mattress, legs crossed, sketchbook in her lap. It had been returned to her without comment that afternoon, as if nothing had ever been taken. The pencil she'd requested 2 days ago, ignored, scoffed at, now appeared on her tray at dinner. The milk was cold for the first time in a week. A blanket arrived without asking. No one explained. No one had to. She hadn't seen her mother since the courtroom, but she'd felt her. Not just her presence, but the echo of her will moving through the corridors like a heat wave. Guards no longer barked. Staff no longer sneered. When La'Akea walked to the cafeteria, the whispers behind her back were uncertain now, tinged with fear. No one had ever come for the other girls like this. Most never had visitors at all, let alone mothers who knew how to speak like lawyers and look like warriors. Something had shifted, and though La'Akea didn't understand the mechanisms, she recognized the current. On the other side of the city, Ronda was already working. Tasha Menendez, her longtime friend and attorney, had secured an emergency meeting with the head of the school board that same evening. It took 1 phone call and less than 10 minutes to schedule. Not because Ronda was famous, but because someone on the board had seen the courtroom transcript, and someone else had watched the video. Because there was a video. The school had not released it. It had not been entered into evidence, nor shared with the public defender. But it existed. A hallway camera angled awkwardly toward the row of lockers where the random inspection had been conducted. It captured everything. The footage was grainy, but the actions were clear. A student, white, tall, with a designer backpack and long blonde hair, had paused at La'Akea's locker. She glanced around, pulled something from her jacket pocket, and dropped it into the open bag hanging on the hook. Then she walked away, adjusting her uniform skirt without haste. Moments later, a staff member arrived and began the inspection. The planted evidence was discovered. Shock and dismay followed. The machine activated, but someone had seen it. A junior IT administrator assigned to clean archived video logs flagged the footage. He didn't know who to give it to. He wasn't even sure it mattered. But then he heard Ronda Rousey had come to court. He burned a copy and slipped it to his supervisor. Within hours, it landed on Tasha's desk. By midnight, they had enough. Emails between school staff and the parents of the real culprit revealed a coordinated effort to protect the reputation of the family involved. "We cannot afford a scandal," one message read. "She's a child. She made a mistake. Maybe there's someone else who could—" The sentence trailed off, unfinished but unmistakable. There was someone else. Ronda stared at the emails in silence. She didn't speak. She didn't shake her head. She simply looked at her daughter's name in black and white and felt something inside her finally break. She turned to Tasha. "We're going back to court today." The judge, newly alert to the public interest and internal rumblings, scheduled an emergency continuation hearing. This time the room was fuller. A few reporters had slipped in, tipped off by whispers. A representative from the Department of Child Welfare sat in the back. A state education liaison, occupied a corner seat, scribbling notes. The air was tighter and the lighting felt harsher. Laakea entered with her ankles unchained. Ronda was already seated, calm, composed, but with a razor behind her eyes. Tasha stood next to her, tablet in hand, expression unreadable. The prosecutor adjusted his tie twice in 30 seconds. The judge opened the session, his tone stiffer than before. "Miss Rousey, you've submitted new material for review?" Tasha stood. "We have, Your Honor, surveillance footage from the school in question, internal emails suggesting administrative misconduct, and a sworn affidavit from an IT administrator who provided the footage under the condition of anonymity." The judge motioned her forward. A screen was rolled in. The footage played. The room held its breath. No one spoke during the 2 minutes of video. When it ended, the silence was suffocating. The judge leaned back, steepled his fingers beneath his chin, and exhaled slowly. "I see." The prosecutor attempted to regain control. "This footage, while concerning, does not negate the presence of contraband in the defendant's possession. It proves she didn't put it there," Tasha shot back. "It proves malicious intent and conspiracy. The evidence was found in her bag." Ronda rose slowly. "So, if I put something in your briefcase and call the police, you go to jail?" The room tensed. The prosecutor turned red. The judge rapped his gavel once, lightly. "Let's maintain decorum," he said, but his voice lacked authority now. Tasha handed the judge a folder. "These are motions for immediate dismissal of charges and a referral for independent investigation into the school's conduct, including suppression of this footage." The judge flipped through the papers. His hand trembled slightly. "I will review the materials," he said, "and issue a written statement within 48 hours. In the meantime, the minor is released into the custody of her mother, pending formal closure of the case." There was no applause, no outburst, just the sound of Laakea breathing, really breathing, for the first time in days. She turned to her mother, who stood waiting with open arms. For a moment, neither moved. Then they stepped into each other's space, and the hug that followed was not dramatic or cinematic. It was simple, absolute. The kind of hug that says, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." As they walked out of the courtroom, eyes followed them, judges, staffers, parents, strangers. But Ronda didn't glance back. She had no interest in their respect. She had come for one reason, and she had won. That night, back in the small 2-bedroom house just outside town, Laakea sat on the couch wrapped in her favorite blanket, her knees pulled up to her chest. She hadn't said much since the hearing. Ronda didn't push. She just stayed close, making tea, answering texts from Tasha, forwarding emails to the new civil rights attorney who had taken an interest. The headlines hadn't hit yet, but they would. Somewhere in a downtown office, a school administrator resigned. Somewhere else, a DA's assistant shredded notes from the original meeting with the principal. People were preparing their excuses, crafting statements, calculating how close they could stand to the fire without burning. But in the small house on the edge of town, a mother and daughter simply sat in silence. Until finally, Laakea spoke. "I didn't think they'd listen. No one ever does." Ronda looked at her. "They don't have to listen," she said quietly. "They just have to feel the consequences of not listening." The next morning, a lawyer for the school district made a statement on the local news. "We regret the incident involving Miss Rousey's daughter and are committed to conducting a full internal review." It was vague, sanitized, but it was the first crack in the wall, and more were coming. The morning after La'Akea was released from juvenile detention dawned quietly, as if the world itself held its breath. The wind outside the modest house where she now stayed with her mother whispered through the blinds, carrying the scent of sea salt and eucalyptus. Inside, the air was still. No television played. No phones rang. Ronda sat at the kitchen table in a gray t-shirt, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee. La'Akea was still asleep in the other room, her breath light, her body curled beneath a fleece blanket like a child trying to shield herself from the last week. For a long time, Ronda didn't move. She just sat, her mind calculating. Her fury, once molten, had hardened into something colder, sharper, a weapon she now wielded deliberately. She'd spent most of the night fielding messages from Tasha and their expanding legal team, civil rights attorneys, former prosecutors. An education policy expert from a nonprofit had called, asking if they could speak later in the week. The dominoes were tipping. The headlines had begun appearing around midnight. MMA star Ronda Rousey confronts schoolover daughter's arrest. New footage reveals possible framing in juvenile drug case. School faces scrutiny after withholding surveillance video. The coverage was still cautious, the language sanitized by lawyers. But it was spreading. Even the morning news anchors, normally detached behind cheerful smiles, looked faintly shaken when they spoke the words suppressed evidence and coordinated misconduct. The system was stirring, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't like the reflection staring back at it. Later that day, Ronda received a call from the office of the district superintendent. It was short and careful. A request for a private meeting. No cameras, no statements, just a conversation. She agreed on one condition, that Tasha attend with her. The meeting took place in a downtown office building with tinted windows and marble floors. The superintendent, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a nervous smile, greeted them with handshakes that lingered too long. He offered water, coffee, small talk. Ronda refused it all. "I want to know," she said, "how many other kids you've buried." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "How many were framed and didn't have someone loud enough to drag them out?" "We take all allegations of misconduct very seriously," he said, falling back on prepared lines, "and we're cooperating fully with the ongoing review." Tasha leaned forward. "The problem is, you only started taking it seriously when a public figure walked into court, not when the system failed a 13-year-old child. I understand how it appears." "No," Ronda cut in. "You don't, and I don't need you to. What I need is access to every report, every arrest, every expulsion over the last 5 years, especially the ones where the charges were later dropped. I want names, I want dates, and I want the patterns." He hesitated. "That's confidential." "For now," she said coldly, "but not for long." They left the meeting without any promises, but Ronda didn't need them. She'd spoken the words aloud in that glass-paneled office, and that alone had weight. People were listening now, and more importantly, they were afraid not to. Meanwhile, back at the juvenile detention center, the mood had shifted. The guards, once smug and dismissive, now moved with visible discomfort. A memo had circulated among staff that morning, a pending audit from the Department of Justice. All personnel were ordered to cooperate. Phones were inspected, files double-checked. The warden, who had ignored La'Akea's initial pleas for a phone call, had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. An interim supervisor, a quiet, meticulous woman named Rivera, took over his responsibilities with little fanfare but firm resolve. The girls inside the facility felt the change too. Whispered questions rippled through the dorms. "Did you hear what happened to that girl? Her mom's famous or something?" "No, it's not just that. They found out she was innocent. They lied about all of it. Even the most hardened among them took notice, not because justice had suddenly bloomed in the stale air, but because someone, for once, had pulled back the curtain. At school, the impact was just as stark. The girl who had planted the drugs, now publicly unnamed but widely identified, had been withdrawn quietly from the academy. Her family released a statement through their attorney, citing mental health concerns and misunderstandings. The administration scrambled to recover its footing. Teachers were instructed not to speak about the case. The headmaster called an emergency meeting with faculty to discuss damage control, but the students talked anyway, in bathrooms, over lunch, in text threads. They talked about the girl with the silent stare and the fighter for a mother, about how they used to joke behind her back, about how maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been the problem. Ronda didn't return La'akea to school immediately. They both needed time. Instead, she hired a tutor and allowed her daughter the space to exist again, to breathe, to read, to draw without fear. Each day, La'akea grew a little more present. She spoke more, ate more, slept more soundly. But Ronda could still see it, the shadow of what had almost consumed her. The way she flinched when the doorbell rang, the way she hesitated before asking a question, as if permission had to be earned. One evening, as twilight fell across the windows, La'akea sat at the kitchen table with her sketchpad. She was drawing again, lines and faces, eyes wide and afraid. Ronda watched from the hallway, unseen. "They all knew," La'akea said softly, not looking up. Ronda entered the room. "What do you mean?" The teachers, the guards, even the lawyer, they knew it was wrong, but they just let it happen. Ronda sat across from her. "That's the problem with systems. They don't break loudly. They decay silently, until someone kicks the door down." La'akea looked up. Her eyes were darker now. Not hard, not bitter, but changed. "You kicked it down." "I did what I had to." "What if you hadn't come?" Ronda reached across the table, placed a hand on her daughter's. "I always come." That night, Tasha called with an update. The state attorney general's office had officially opened a probe into the juvenile detention system. Several employees were under investigation for misconduct. The judge from the first hearing was facing a review from the State Judicial Commission, and a civil suit, filed in La'akea's name, was already gaining momentum. But, perhaps most significantly, a coalition of educators and legal advocates sparked by the case had announced the formation of a task force to re-examine disciplinary policies in private schools across the state. Ronda was invited to speak. Not as a celebrity, not as a fighter, as a mother. When she told La'akea about the invitation, the girl blinked in surprise. "Are you going to do it?" "I don't know," Ronda admitted. "I'm not a politician, but they're listening now." Ronda paused. "Yeah, they are." 3 days later, she stood in front of a crowded auditorium. Teachers, counselors, attorneys, and journalists filling every seat. The stage was bare. No lights, no banners, just a single microphone and the silence of attention. She didn't give a speech. She told a story. About a girl who asked for help and was laughed at. About a mother who wasn't called. About a courtroom that cared more about a name than a child. She ended simply, "I didn't come to burn the system down. I came to remind it that my daughter has a name, and that name will never be forgotten again. The room stood in silence. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to rise. Not in applause, in recognition. Outside, under a gray sky threatening rain, Ronda met her daughter on the sidewalk. Laakea had waited quietly, sketchpad in hand. "Did you say what you needed to say?" she asked. "I said what mattered." They walked home together, no cameras following, no headlines waiting. Just two voices. One louder than before. One finally heard. For the first time in weeks, Laakea woke without the weight of fear pressing against her chest. The bedroom felt still but safe, washed in the pale blue light of early morning. The familiar creak of the house settling, the faint hiss of the kettle in the kitchen, and the rhythmic tread of her mother's footsteps on the hardwood floor grounded her in something real. For days now, she had lived in this quiet rhythm. Soft days without handcuffs, without harsh voices calling her defendant, without locked doors keeping her in. But the quiet was deceiving. Beneath it ran a current, something bigger than she could understand. It moved through the walls of that courthouse, through newsrooms, through people who had looked away for far too long and now could not afford to blink. Today was the next court hearing, the one that would decide not just whether she would be punished for something she hadn't done, but whether the system itself would admit that it had failed her. Again. She dressed in silence. Her clothes, though plain, a cream-colored blouse and gray slacks, were hers. Not a uniform, not assigned. The shoes pinched a little, borrowed from a neighbor, but they were free of numbers printed on the heel. She didn't feel powerful, but she didn't feel powerless either. Ronda sat at the table, phone in hand, scanning messages from Tasha and the legal team. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her face was unreadable. She glanced up when Laakea entered the room, her eyes softening just slightly. "You ready?" Laakea hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." The drive to the courthouse passed in silence, but it wasn't the tense, fragile silence of fear. It was a gathering one, focused, measured. When they arrived, the front steps were busier than they had been before. A few journalists hovered near the bottom, cameras lowered, eyes alert. Legal observers moved quickly between the entrance and the sidewalk, clipboards in hand. There was a sense, unspoken but heavy in the air, that something significant was about to happen. Inside, the courtroom was filled, not the casual audience of court staff and waiting parents that had been there during her earlier hearings. Now, there were rows of sharply dressed lawyers, media correspondents, representatives from the Department of Justice, even two off-duty judges seated quietly in the back row. The room buzzed, but no one spoke loudly. It was not a circus. It was a reckoning. At the defense table, Tasha sat with her back straight, her tablet glowing softly. A second attorney, one Laakea didn't know, leaned in and whispered something to her. Tasha nodded without looking up. Ronda guided her daughter to her seat with a light touch on her shoulder, then took her place just behind her, close enough that Laakea could feel the warmth of her presence. Judge Ramirez entered the room with a practiced step, robes flowing behind him, a subtle frown already forming between his eyebrows. He was not the same judge from the previous hearings. The original one had recused himself days ago, following the public outcry and a preliminary ethics inquiry. Ramirez was known for his neutrality, his composure, and, most importantly, his fearlessness in courtrooms that often drowned in compromise. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and opened the thick folder in front of him. This court is now in session for the matter of Ronda Rousey, We will be reviewing the motion for dismissal submitted by the defense, as well as the attached affidavits, evidence supplements, and relevant procedural violations. He glanced at La'Akea. Miss Rousey, good morning. Good morning, Your Honor, she said quietly. Tasha stood. Her voice, as always, was steady, clear. Your Honor, we present a motion not merely for dismissal, but for complete expungement of all charges based on demonstrable violations of constitutional rights, misconduct by school officials, and willful negligence by parties responsible for the welfare of this child. She moved with precision, presenting evidence with the same sharpness she might wield in a federal court. Surveillance footage played on the monitor again, followed by email threads, internal memos, and personnel logs from the school. One of the documents included instructions from the school principal to delay disclosure of relevant materials until after the detention hearing, citing concerns about escalating external involvement. Ramirez didn't blink. He simply took notes. Next came the forensic report, an independent analysis that invalidated the fingerprint match initially cited by police. The evidence had not only been circumstantial but scientifically flawed. A copy of the public defender's calendar showed that he had been scheduled in 2 courtrooms simultaneously on the morning of La'Akea's hearing, explaining why he had failed to meet with her before standing beside her in court. It was all here now, laid bare. Then came the final witness. From the back of the room, a man in plain clothes stood and approached the bench. He introduced himself as Gregory Hall, a former assistant in the county forensic lab. He held a folder thick with papers. His voice trembled slightly as he began. I was asked to review a partial lab analysis of the substances allegedly found in Miss Rousey's possession. What I discovered was that a DNA report had been completed, signed, and time-stamped, concluding there was no match to the defendant. It was filed and then omitted from the prosecution's materials. The room went still. He continued, his voice firmer now. I resigned 3 months ago. I didn't speak because I was afraid for my career, but this girl's life was nearly destroyed, and I can't be quiet anymore. He handed the folder to the bailiff. Tasha entered it into the record. The prosecutor's rebuttal was weak, a pale imitation of authority. He stammered through half-hearted objections, citing breakdowns in communication and technical oversights. He attempted to preserve the narrative, but the foundation had already crumbled beneath him. When it was over, Judge Ramirez closed the file in front of him, steepled his hands, and sat in silence for a moment that felt like an hour. This court finds that the defendant's constitutional rights were not only violated, but repeatedly ignored. The chain of events leading to her detainment demonstrates systemic failure and deliberate suppression of exculpatory evidence. Therefore, all charges are vacated, effective immediately, and the court refers the conduct of all involved parties to the State Attorney General's office for further investigation. He looked at La'Akea not as a judge looking at a defendant, but as a man addressing a human being. You were failed, Miss Rousey. This courtroom owes you more than a ruling. It owes you an apology. He rose. The gavel struck. It was done. But there was no eruption of sound, no cathartic applause, just silence. Deep, resonant, the kind that fills the air when truth finally emerges after being buried alive. La'Akea sat still for a long moment, her breath caught in her throat. Then she turned slowly toward her mother, who was already standing. Ronda didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her eyes said it all. They left the courthouse not through the back entrance this time, but through the main doors. Outside, a small group of journalists waited, unsure whether to approach. Ronda nodded once at them, then placed a firm hand on her daughter's shoulder, guiding her down the steps. That night, Laakea sat on the floor of her room with her sketchpad open. She tried to draw the judge, the courtroom, the moment the gavel fell, but everything came out wrong. The lines were too thick, the eyes didn't match, the scale felt distorted. She closed the book and stared at the ceiling instead, the quiet pressing in again, but differently this time. Not like a cage, like a space. "I'm free," she whispered, as if testing the shape of the words. But freedom, she was learning, wasn't like flipping a switch. The echoes of confinement still lingered. The wounds were internal, healing in unpredictable ways. There were still shadows in her dreams, still hesitations in her movements, still silence in her voice that hadn't been filled. But she wasn't alone anymore. And that changed everything. The morning after the final hearing, the sun rose over the quiet street where Laakea and her mother now lived with slow, golden insistence. Light slipped across the windowsill, catching on the dust motes that hovered gently in the air, illuminating the silence inside the house with a calm that had, until recently, felt impossible. But this stillness was not the silence of fear, nor the mute denial of justice. It was the quiet that follows a storm, the pause before healing begins. In the kitchen, Rhonda poured coffee into a ceramic mug with chipped glaze, the handle warm beneath her fingers. The television, muted, played coverage of the hearing on a loop. Her name scrolled across the bottom of the screen, but she didn't look. Her eyes were on the hallway, listening for footsteps, waiting for the sound of Laakea's door creaking open. When it finally did, the girl emerged not with the wariness she had carried like armor for so many days, but with something gentler. She wore an oversized hoodie and sweatpants, her hair pulled into a messy bun, a faint flush in her cheeks from sleep. Rhonda turned to her daughter, studying her the way a sculptor might examine marble, searching for cracks, measuring progress. Laakea looked back and for once didn't look away. "Sleep okay?" Rhonda asked. Laakea nodded. "Yeah, I didn't dream about it last night." That was new. They sat together, eating toast and fruit in the slow rhythm of people recovering from a long illness. Outside, the world still spun, but inside, time moved differently. After breakfast, Laakea disappeared into her room. Rhonda cleaned the dishes, answered emails, declined 3 media interview requests, and ignored 5 more. Then she found the folder she'd left on the kitchen table the night before, a manila envelope marked with the seal of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Inside were official acknowledgments, copies of internal investigations, and a letter of commendation addressed not to Laakea, but to Rhonda herself. It praised her for her intervention, cited her actions as a catalyst for administrative reform, and referred obliquely to policy implications in juvenile justice protocols. But it said nothing of the days her daughter spent alone in a cell. Nothing about the silence in that courtroom when she begged for a phone call. Nothing about the mockery, the handcuffs, the sound of a gavel that nearly buried her child alive. Rhonda folded the letter neatly and returned it to the envelope without a word. That afternoon, a package arrived by courier. Inside was a book from the Department of Justice detailing the findings of their inquiry. Dozens of pages documenting procedural failures, racial bias patterns, and administrative inconsistencies. Attached was a statement of apology, neutral, sterile, unsigned. Rhonda left it on the coffee table. Later, Laakea sat on the porch with her sketchpad. Her drawings had changed since her release. They were still stark, still precise, but the faces now carried depth, layers of emotion, shadows behind the eyes. She drew not from memory alone, but from something deeper. Witness. She sketched the face of a girl named Tamika who had shared her cot in the detention center. The janitor who had quietly slipped her a second apple one morning. The counselor who said nothing but left a Time magazine on the bench after lights out. Each portrait was a record, a refusal to forget. One evening, Laakea turned to her mother and asked the question that had been living inside her since the beginning. Why did they think I was nobody? Rhonda took a breath. She didn't offer platitudes. Because it was easier for them to pretend you were, she said. Because they thought no one would walk through that courtroom door for you. She met her daughter's gaze, steady as ever. They were wrong. Laakea didn't respond at first. Then she picked up her pencil and began to draw again. Not the courtroom this time, not the judge, not even herself. She drew her mother. Not as a fighter, not as a celebrity, just as a woman walking into a room full of people who had already decided the outcome and refusing to let them win. The next week, a civics teacher from a nearby high school reached out. She had seen the news coverage, heard fragments of the story whispered among students. She didn't want a media circus, no cameras, no microphones, just a conversation. An honest one. Rhonda hesitated when she received the email. She showed it to Laakea without comment. The girl read it once, then twice. "I'll go," she said. They arrived at the school together, walking through double doors into a room filled with 30 teenagers, half interested, half bored. The teacher introduced her simply as Laakea. No fanfare, no biography. The girl stood at the front, hands in the pocket of her hoodie, and began to speak. She didn't shout, didn't recite legal jargon. She told them what happened. She told them about the day they pulled her out of class, about the way the officer avoided her eyes, about sitting in a cold room with a sandwich she didn't touch, about asking to call her mother and hearing the judge laugh, about how easy it was for everyone to pretend she didn't matter. The room changed. It wasn't loud, no gasps or interruptions, just quiet. When she finished, a girl in the front row raised her hand. "What do you want to do now?" Laakea thought for a long moment. "I want to make sure no one else disappears the way I did." That answer lingered, heavier than applause. Afterward, students approached her, not to take selfies, not to ask about her mother, but to tell her stories about brothers on probation, cousins expelled from school, sisters who never spoke about what happened when they were searched without cause. "You sound like my brother," one boy said before walking away, eyes bright with something unspoken. Rhonda heard about the visit later that night. Laakea didn't say much about it, just sat at the table, sketching. But Rhonda saw the change. The quiet was still there, but it was filled now, with purpose, with voice. She handed her daughter a new notebook, blank, unused. "Keep telling the truth," she said. In the following months, investigations continued to unfold. The detention facility's director resigned. Several staff members were placed on leave, and 2 were formally charged with obstruction of justice. The original judge retired under pressure, citing family reasons. The school's headmaster stepped down after weeks of media scrutiny, and several board members were replaced. The Department of Education began rewriting guidelines for disciplinary procedures in private institutions. But perhaps most enduring was what Laakea built quietly from home. She began collecting stories, letters, interviews, portraits. She titled the project Forgotten Faces, and it grew. It traveled, first to a small gallery downtown, then to a library exhibit, then across cities. The portraits weren't framed in gold. They were pinned with thumbtacks, hung from fishing wire, laid bare against unvarnished walls. But people came. They lingered. They read the quotes written in the corners of each frame. I was 14 when they cuffed me. No one called my mom. They said I looked like the kind of kid who'd do it. No one believed me. Still doesn't. At one show, a boy about her age stood for nearly 20 minutes in front of a portrait of a 17-year-old named Jerome, sentenced to 30 years for a nonviolent offense. The boy didn't speak. When he finally walked away, he left behind a note taped to the corner. "Thank you for seeing us." Ronda found the note weeks later in La Akea's room, tucked between sketchbooks. The system had tried to erase her daughter, but the truth had brought her back. And now she was drawing others forward, one story at a time. Not as a fighter, not as a victim, but as someone who had vanished into silence and returned to make sure no one else had to. The world wanted a hero's arc, but real stories were jagged, unfinished, stitched together from the broken places. And sometimes the greatest fight wasn't in a ring. It was walking into a courtroom that had already decided your fate and refusing to disappear. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos on the channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it.